is Wednesday, April 26th. We are at Orchard Park High School. As part of our Hometown Heroes project, we are interviewing Bill Lockerman, who served in the armed forces during the Vietnam era. The interviewers are...
Dana Andrzejewski.
And James Stevenson.
Okay. The interview will be about a half an hour. Speak up because you don't have lapel mics on.
Okay.
They're doing all the recording from there. And I'll be back in about a half an hour and learn about what life was like during the Vietnam War and have a good time. Learn a lot. Okay.
Okay, so,
Did you enlist in the armed forces, or?
Yeah, yes, I did. I was at Westchester State College, which is just south of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I applied for OCS, Officer Candidate School, was accepted. And since I graduated in January, I went up to OCS in February of '62. There's a 4-month, 16-week program. And at that time, I was commissioned in June of '62.
What were your years of service?
My active duty service from 1962 to 1965, and I continued in the reserves and officially retired October 1st, 1992.
was that hard on you to retire,
At that point, no.
or?
We had gone through the first Iraq, or not the Iraq, but the Middle East situation over there, Desert Storm. I had tried to go back on active duty, and unfortunately, they didn't need an old man like me anymore. And so at that point, I decided may as well hang it up. 30 years, 8 months is a long time.
Yeah. Did you see any combat then, while you were in the armed forces, or no?
No, I did not.
Were you, now like the Vietnam War conflict, if you want to call it that, was really turbulent. Were you treated any different for being in the armed services?
To the best of my knowledge, not really. I got out off active duty in 1965. At that time, the Vietnam era was just really starting to build up, even though that we had been in there since the late 50s. I started out my career, as a white hat, and I just brought this as a, a little demonstration type of thing. From there, when I was commissioned, I went into the Navy underwater demolition teams. Now, they're the father, you might say, of the Navy SEALs today. And at that time, the Navy SEALs did not start till February of 1962. And I went down there in June of '62 to begin my training. I actually went through 2 training classes, but did not complete either one of them because of injury. And in those days, there was a very limited number of people that were in the underwater demolition teams and the SEAL teams as compared to today. Today there's thousands of them, where in those days there were 2 teams of 100 on the East Coast and West Coast, total 400, and 1 team of SEALs on the East and West Coast, total 50, so there's a total of only 500 people. The programs of when you went in, the attrition rate was around 70–75%, i.e. out of every 25, 30 people out of 100. And in fact, in some classes it was even higher. It might have been as high as 80% attrition. Very rigorous. And because it was a volunteer type of situation, you were able to quit anytime you wished to. And the first couple of weeks, there were a lot of people would start to drop out because it was very, very rigorous. Much more so than anything that a pro athlete or a college or high school player, athlete would ever go through. And the reason being is that you were constantly doing something from first thing in the morning till the time you went to bed. You were involved in a physical activity the vast majority of the time. Probably at least 75% of the day was geared to physical.
Wow.
You mentioned that you had to drop out of the training because of injuries. How were you injured?
The first injury he had was a knee, the right knee, and it was not diagnosed as well as it could have been, I guess. But in those days, what we had available was not the same as we have today. You know, the technology that's available. And even though they put it in a cast for 30 days and whatever, they thought it was corrected. And at that point, I was working with weights, and I would lift 65 pounds with one leg, which was the bad leg. Went down to the underwater swimmer school down at Key West, and I re-injured it down there. The swimming school in those days was a lot different than it is today. We dealt with very heavy tanks. We had 80-pound tanks, and today it's a different type. And the whole training was geared for a different type of. It wasn't for recreational scuba. Let's put it that way. And at that very time, I was also down there for I was attached to the teams for the fact that the Cuban crisis was on. I don't know if you remember anything about the Cuban crisis, but that began in October of '62, and that's when I went down there during that exact time.
What are some of your most memorable experiences that you had throughout your training or your active duty, or even your reserves?
Well, on my active duty, I would say that being involved with the Navy underwater demolition teams and being privy to some of the things that we were doing in those days was very, very exciting, and much of that's still kind of classified. The one thing that I was involved with back in the spring of 1963, I was on an evaluation group or team, you might say, that was looking at what kind of craft we were going to use over at Naval. And they brought up two of the World War II type of PT boats, which were 100-some feet long and powered by these very powerful Packard engines. They were very, very beautiful boats. They were, mahogany and teak and all that business. But the maintenance on them were very high. Very fast, very quick, but there was a lot of heavy maintenance involved with it. Plus, being gasoline, they were more subject to a problem that could happen. We also had something called a Norwegian Nasty class, which was a triple banked diesel boat, and it could go and achieve the same speeds and had as good, if not better, maneuverability than our own PT boats. And so that particular boat was finally approved and was used over in Vietnam for delivery of the teams.
How far did you go in ranks in the Navy?
When I left active duty, I was Lieutenant JG at that time. From there, I was promoted as a lieutenant, and finally, when I was here in Buffalo area, I made captain, which is a four-striper, the same as a colonel in the Air Force or Army or Marine Corps.
It's a 4-stripe?
4 stripes.
What are the differences in the stripes?
Well,
are there different colors? Or?
No, typically in the Navy it's gold stripes, and I have the pictures here, but she took them. Well, your single stripe is for an ensign, and then you have double stripe for lieutenant, and then you have 2.5 stripes for lieutenant commander, and then 3 stripes for commander, and 4 stripes for captain, and they're worn on the sleeve, or they have your designators up in here, and this is typified by an eagle, which it signifies that you're a captain.
What have you, like, what was your career outside of the military? I know you were
In education, when I was released from active duty, I went back to I was teaching. In fact, I taught science for my first year, and 2 years I taught physical education, and finished up my master's. Then went on to Temple University, where I eventually received my doctorate. And then I came here to the University of Buffalo, and I was the acting chair for the graduate program in physical education. Also, I ran the lab. We had a research lab, and that's what I really came up here to do. My background, I had a doctorate in physical education, but it was more dealing with research methods, motor learning, and some exercise physiology. So it wasn't just, learning how to go and do a basketball.
Yeah.
But I had been involved in some major work at Temple in a new building. They were building a new gymnasium. And so Dr. Teresa, who was the superintendent of schools at that time, they had interviewed a number of people for the job of the director here at Orchard Park. And somebody put my name in. In fact, I was on active duty for training at that time down in Bayonne, New Jersey, on Huntington. Got a phone call asking if I would come up for an interview, which I did, and subsequently did receive the job. But can we go back to active duty a little bit?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. My final, I went into a second training class with the Navy underwater demolition teams, and during that training period, I had a broken back, which was actually a compressed vertebrae. And I had been slated to go with the SEAL teams at that point. And of course that stopped that action.
Yeah.
So I had several months of what they call limited duty. And at that time, there was a ship that was being brought out of mothballs and being converted into a major communications relay ship. Now, that probably means nothing to you. And this may be really hard to understand, but I'll try to explain it. Today, you can pick up your cell phone and you're able to communicate with people any place, almost any place in the world. Especially if you have a cell phone that will operate off a satellite. But in 1962, 63, 64, you didn't have cell phones, you didn't have satellites that were for communications. And for people to be able to communicate long distances, it was extremely difficult. And when you have ships out there, they need to communicate and get information from, let's say, Washington or wherever it might be, and they weren't able to do it very efficiently. They built two ships. Actually, they brought two old World War II baby flat tops, 600 and some feet long, and made them into communication relay ships where they put all this fancy antenna up on the flight deck and had very, very powerful transmitters, plus ultra sophisticated receiving equipment. And we would go out with the fleet and stand off maybe 100 miles, and we would be able to catch a signal that they normally couldn't do because of our sensitivity and our better antennae and whatever. And then we would reproduce that and send it back out to the fleet.
Okay. What was the name of that ship?
That was the Annapolis HEMR-1, USS Annapolis. And I started in communications on that ship and qualified as a junior officer, and I was able to qualify for all 4 watch stations that we had aboard the ship at that time for communications. But rank has its privilege, and I was kind of a junior person. and I just made Lieutenant JG. So what happened is that as more senior people came in, then I started to drop down because everything's always done by seniority.
Yeah.
I had an opportunity at that point to go into engineering, and I took it because it allowed me then to have my own division and to stand watches and whatever and be the person responsible. And it turned out to be really a very, very good thing for me because I learned an awful lot. And that helped me out a great deal with my reserve time after I got off active duty. And from there, the last couple of months I spent with operations staff, Com 5, which is located in Norfolk. And was a watchstander during, things were starting to get really built up at that time.
Yeah.
So it was kind of an exciting time.
Did you ever sort of regret not being able to go to Vietnam, or now looking back, do you think that you almost got lucky? Like, or is it?
Well, I think that that's a very good question. Because yes, in a way, I look back at it today and I say to myself, I was really lucky I didn't go over there because I could have gotten myself, easily, harmed, killed, whatever. But when I left the underwater demolition teams, I was very, very disappointed. I had to.
Yeah.
I really, was geared up, and I was like one of the top people in my class. It's hard when you take a look at a person like me today that weighs 220 pounds and kind of think of him when he's 150 or 155 pounds. But it was a lean, mean, just like a wrestler or whatever.
Yeah.
And I had worked so hard to get where I was, and I was so close, and to get hurt again was,
Yeah.
it was a great disappointment. And plus, you knew all these people. You've been involved with them. And one of the things that you have here on your little crib sheet, do you remember any of your instructors? Well, yes, I do. I still remember them to this day. And they were very, very powerful people. One of them was a Philippine chief who had, during the war, World War II, had been one of the original underwater demolition people, and had just so much knowledge, and had such great leadership qualities that he could get you to do so many different things, and he didn't have to yell at you to do it, but he had a way of doing it. He was just a little fellow. And the other one was a chief Afro-American, which was very unusual at that time. He was Chief Waddell, and he had never worn a pair of shoes till he came into the service. He was born and raised down in the Georgia swamps. There's a great myth that black people can't swim, and that's really a huge myth because that's not true. And one of my swim partners was, in fact, a black man. And he was an exceptional person. He was an expert in the use of a crossbow. And you might say, why do you have a crossbow? Well, the thing is that when you fire a gun, it makes noise. When you want to take somebody out, a knife or something of this nature is much more effective for keeping silence.
Yeah.
Did you win any awards or medals besides like your ranks?
No, not really. I mean, I have some medals, but they're not of any consequence, for campaign or anything.
Okay.
Why did you leave the active reserves? Just to go on and do something else, or?
Well, I
I
felt that I was starting to come to a dead end. My wife, was encouraged me to get off and to resume, what I had gone to college for, whatever. But one of the first things I did as soon as I did get off active duty was to see how or if I could get into the reserves.
Yeah.
And I did that. was quite fortunate. I was with a destroyer squadron. Actually, it was Destroyer Squadron 30 out of Philadelphia. And at that time, they had 2 destroyer escorts and 2 destroyers there. And I was assigned to the destroyer escort, the Blackwood, which was a turbo-electric ship. And its sister ship was the Snowden, which was a diesel. Now, these were both World War II vintage ships. And when they built ships in those days, they were really, escort ships were designed for one-way. You know,
Yeah.
they didn't have a whole lot of backup on them or anything else, so you didn't have 2 pumps for everything, you only had 1 pump. And so if something went wrong, you had to get that pump fixed. And, you know, by this time, you know, this ship is 20 years old, or older. Certainly it was older than 20 years. But it had a very interesting engineering crew in that it was going back into the old days, they used to go and call the engineering crew the Black Gang. And the reason they did, do you have any idea why?
So,
Well, they used to go and fire up the steam with coal. And so you had all this coal soot on you all the time, so you had this, you know, the Black Gang. Well, in my case, we had a great majority of our people were Afro-American, and they were extremely proud, and many of them were World War II vets. They had just stuck together, and they just really enjoyed, you know, being together and doing a super duper job. They had been called up 3 times before I came on the ship. In recent history, they got called up for the Berlin crisis back in '60, then the Cuban crisis in '62, which I have already spoken about, and then again for the Dominican Republic. And they were underway within 24 hours of being called up, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it, that these people were located in all different parts, you know, hundreds of miles away, some of them. But they all got there and steamed away.
Did you have anybody, like really close to you, like one of your friends or your comrades that went over to Vietnam and was injured or killed? And was that really hard on you if that did happen?
I've known a number of people who did go over and did, well, they died. And I think that any time that anyone receives injury, this is, be it, you know, like today, what we're having in the Iraq situation, is that many of the people who are being injured would never have lived back in the Vietnam era.
Yeah.
Today they are living.
Yeah.
And so now we have people who are extremely disabled or have received, you know, very, very traumatic injuries that never would have, there's no way they would have lived just a few years ago. So anybody that gets maimed or killed, you feel, yes, you feel very bad about that.
You mentioned your wife. Do you, can we have her name?
Alice.
Do you have any kids?
And I have one daughter, her name is Alice. And I'll be, we've been married now for 43 years, coming up on 44 in June.
Love every minute of it.
Were you married before you entered the service?
No,
or during?
I was married right after commission, or just before I was commissioned.
Okay.
And was it hard on her to see you?
Yes, it was very difficult. And I think part of the problem is that being hospitalized, you know, a couple times, that really takes it out of you.
Yeah.
And especially when you're great with child.
Let's see.
So you taught in Orchard Park and in Springville, you said earlier?
No, I never taught. I was the director of health and
Okay.
physical education here. Amongst other things, here at Orchard Park, I was the acting transportation supervisor, the acting buildings and grounds. I was vice principal here at this high school.
Before they had the 3 principals?
Yeah, they had the 3 principals at that time,
did.
and one of them left for in fact, he left permanently. They thought it might be just temporary at that point. And I filled in where I would come over here for a couple hours a day and help out Dr. Jack Abels.
Were you originally from Buffalo or the Buffalo area?
No, I'm originally from the Philadelphia area. And actually went back to my old high school to do my first 3 years of teaching and coaching.
So you came to UB to be once you got your doctorate, right?
Yes. And I taught primarily in the graduate school. One of my better students is Mr. Trampert.
Did you have anybody that you really kept in touch with? Like from your active duty or your reserves?
From the reserves, yes. When I came here to Buffalo in 1970, I did not join the reserves till 1971 here, and I was still commuting back to Philadelphia. And the reason was simply is that I enjoyed getting underway. To go back to those two, I was telling you about these 2 ships, these little destroyer escorts. We would go out and work with nuclear propelled submarines, and they would put a junior officer, you know, in charge.
Yeah.
And we would catch them every time, because our turning radius and our ability to speed up so quickly, they weren't really familiar with that, because there weren't that many of these type of ships still around. But then once they found out, you know, that, and so that's why their skippers used to always put their junior officers in there to teach them that, you know, you have to be careful of anything and everything that's up there.
Yeah.
And so that was really a lot of, you know, in a way it was a lot of fun. And I was an engineering officer, but I used to also get up on the bridge and, you know, con the ship.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed that a great deal. I think that the guys down below always worked a little harder when I was up on the bridge to make sure that I looked good. When I came up here to Buffalo, I had an opportunity to get into the reserve program, and fortunately, because of my background of being very active in the reserves and having, you know, like a real ship to work with, I was able to bring some experiences here to the Buffalo area that they did not have.
Yeah.
And I caught the eye of, and I was at that time a lieutenant, and I caught the eye of the group commander of the reserve program down here, and at that time there was like, oh, maybe 500, 600, 700 people involved in the reserves in the Navy that met down here at Porter Avenue. So he kind of took me under his wing and put me into his command, his staff, gave me opportunities to work with a great number of the different reserves up here. And when the opportunity opened up, I was able to get command of a unit. Yeah. And subsequently I had 3 more commands for a total of 4 commands here. The last one being they have a landing craft down here at the foot of Porter Avenue, and it's about 135 feet long, 37 feet wide. It can carry 3 tanks. So I had command of that.
What was the name of
and
that?
That's an LCU. It's a landing craft utility. And it's a ship that, or a boat that still is operated a great deal for unloading cargo, moving large mobile equipment, you know, jeeps, trucks, tanks, whatever. And over that period of time, especially here in Buffalo, you develop a lot of close relationships. And unfortunately, I've had to bury several of those people because, you know, people die, unfortunately. I'm 67 years old, and many of my colleagues who are in their 70s, you know, they're passing on. And that's what happens with veterans. It happens with everybody, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You don't have to be a veteran to be passing on. But fortunately, I mean, I developed some great relationships. And people that I still have lunch with on a regular basis. I had some really, really great enlisted people. I had a few of them that actually went in all 4 of my commands. They went with me as I went from one command to the next.
Yeah.
And I brought them along. They were kind of a nucleus. And they performed extremely well. We were one of the first units to ever have a out of CONUS, which is a continental United States, Acdutra, where they flew us over to Rota, Spain. We picked up the ship there. I was the operations officer, not only as a reserve, but in actuality, I was the operations officer for the commander of the amphibious force, which was several ships. And it was my responsibility to get us all back across the big pond. And that was very interesting, and our people performed, our reservists performed extremely well. So that was the kind of relationship that I was able to develop with my active duty command, who had enough faith in us, and when I say us, I'm referring not me personally as much as our whole total group, that we could do the job. And that was important. And we proved that we were very effective. So it was a great time. Many of those men today are passing on very quickly now.
Yeah.
I have too many funerals to go to.
Back to the underwater demolition team. Was that dealing with like more of the, like as you would go in with scuba gear, or was that more like submarines? Like what exactly?
Okay, I'll try to explain it to you that in those days, we were responsible for what they call up to the high water mark. If you go down to the beach and you'll see where the water goes as high as it goes, that's where we stopped.
Okay.
And our job was to determine what was from there out, going out off the beach, and any obstacles that were there. And
Yeah.
first of all, we would identify them. And then secondly is that we would then develop a plan to blow them up, because that was the only way to get rid of them. And then we would blow them up. Literally, in our high-tech society today, this is, it's hard to believe all this, but all we have is a little plastic plate that we had,
Yeah.
and a grease pencil, we were writing on it underwater. And today you have all these computers and all that. And we would come back and lay this out, because they had like what they called a string line reconnaissance. And so we would have people anywhere from, depending upon what the situation was, anywhere from 10 to 20 yards apart. And then you would go in on the beach, and each of us would record what we could do. So a lot of this was not done with scuba gear. It was done with, you were free swimming
Okay.
with a snorkel, and that was about it. And you identified what you had out there. Now, if there was a hostile beach, later on, you'd be using scuba gear for this,
Yeah.
so that they couldn't see it. And we have what they call a Draeger lung. The Draeger lung was a rebreather where it didn't let off any bubbles.
Yeah.
But you take it down to below 35 feet, and it would start to create some problems for you sometimes. And if you get a leak, it was a very difficult piece of equipment to swim with.
Yeah.
And even our big tanks were difficult. They were very heavy, even they're buoyant in the,
Yeah.
but trying to go in the water with them and going out was another problem. But our job, that's what our job was. So we weren't people who were toting rifles around and that kind of thing very much.
You were people who were toting explosives around.
Right. But then what happened is that with the SEALs, you had to be a UDT person to become a SEAL person.
Mm-hmm.
So more and more of our training got more and more with hand-to-hand combat, and I'm talking about a really high level here now. I'm not talking about just a little indoctrination.
Yeah.
And then we had small arms and rifle training, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And this became very sophisticated. And then the next thing that they wanted you to do was to be able to do languages. Spanish being one of the ones that they really were working on in those days. And there were special schools for that. So our job for the underwater demolition teams started to go and dissolve. Now we also operate out of submarines. And that was a delivery vehicle, but it wasn't the vehicle that was prominently used at that time. That was something that was just starting to be done.
Yeah.
Prior to that, they used to go and have the subs that would be standing off, and then you would paddle in. In other words, you have a rubber boat, you go in there, and then you paddle into the beach. But it was found that these guys in UDT were very, very effective, because we also were, at this point, starting to go out of airplanes.
Yeah.
And so you became jump qualified. You went down to Fort Benning and did your jump training down there. We also worked off helicopters.
Mm-hmm.
And you would swing out and then drop into the water.
Yeah.
And this was, you weren't being roped down, you were just swinging out.
Yeah.
Sometimes these young pilots forgot that they had to make adjustments as somebody left. The weight, you kind of go up in a staircase.
Yeah.
And if you had to be like the last person out and that guy had to make his adjustments, you were now at a much higher than you should be. Instead of being at 15 feet, now you're at 35, 40, 50 feet. And that wasn't a pleasant experience to have that happen.
So did you study any languages then?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I would have had to, but I did not.
I think we have most of our questions asked at this point. Mrs. Kessler just walked in, so she should be able to take the pictures for us. Do you have anything else that you would have that you wanted to say?
I don't think so. I think that we've pretty much covered the waterfront here.
I have one more question. Just about obviously you had people that you knew in Vietnam. You had, you were part of the armed forces. You were very supportive of that. Did it bother you at all that people were very unsupportive of that during the Vietnam War?
Yes. That probably really started to rear its ugly head in the late 60s, early 70s. I was down at teaching at Temple University at that time. And this was back in 68, 69, and the first part of 70. It was the students were rioting, the Kent State situation that occurred.
Yeah.
And being in the service was not a very popular thing. Ironically, it's still my opinion that there's many people who are rather non-supportive of the services.
Yeah.
I'll give you one quick. If you remember, I was telling you about I had this unit where we went over to Rota, Spain, and whatever. Well, they offered me an opportunity to go on active duty for 6 months, and I came back here and talked to the superintendent, and the superintendent was very, very uncooperative, and he would not allow me to do that, or if I wanted to do it, I would lose my job. And that developed a strong dissatisfaction with him, and when I had an opportunity, I left here. And then I went down to Springville for 20 years as a school business administrator. But and his attitude was, I believe was an anti-military.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Because you can still see that today, like with the Iraq conflict and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it was very prominent during the Vietnam War. So.
And for me, that would have been an opportunity, really, I would have had a very good opportunity to maybe a made admiral
Yeah.
with my background.
Okay, well,
We're kind of wrapped up?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're
Yep.
interested actually.
Okay, great. Did this click?
yeah.
How long ago?
5 minutes or so.
Yeah, like 5 to 10 minutes, like that, maybe.
These are yours.